Just to make it more interesting for you all, I'm sure. Once upon a time I was a material scientist, so I'm going to try and explain printing in terms of material science. I'm sure all of you are wonderfully excited by the products of printing, all those words you can read in books. Let me assure you that printers who actually put the ink on the paper really are not interested in that aspect of it. They're interested in getting ink to stick to paper. That's what printing is about for a printer. So printing, you need a surface to print from. Letterpress printing, you have a raised surface, you put ink on the raised parts. You need ink, you need paper, and you need one of these. And I'm going to try and explain why. Gutenberg, you've all heard of Gutenberg? I mean, you must have all heard of Gutenberg. You couldn't be in a place like the Bodleian without having heard of Gutenberg. His invention was movable type. Prior to movable type, if you wanted to print an image, you took a piece of wood and you cut away the bits you didn't want to print, and you had a xylographic surface, xylographic printing, piece of wood. Works very well, nothing wrong with it, fine. Nothing wrong with it except if you want to do books. You need one of these for each page of the book, and that one thing will only print that one page of that one book. Gutenberg's great idea was to come up with a method of printing any book using interchangeable letters, movable type, and you can come and have a look at this in a minute. It says movable type. To make movable type, to make individual letters, you need a fairly efficient way of doing that. A typical page of Gutenberg's Bible contained many hundreds of letters. You need to be able to manufacture them in quantity and repeatably. And you end up, pretty much certainly, this is a material scientist's view, casting them. And you cast them using metal. And there you have the first difference from this. This is wood, type is metal. And that has consequences. Yes. The ink you use for a wooden surface, you can use water-based ink. Water-based inks stick to wood very nicely. If you put a drop of water on some wood, it will spread and it will stick, and it works fine. That's how things like the Diamond Sutra that you'll find in British Library down in London, that's how it was printed. Water-based ink, plonk a piece of paper on top, rub the back. Great. Water-based inks do not work very well with metal. To get a nice even coverage on a metal surface, you need oily ink. You put a drop of oil on your beautiful stainless steel draining board, it will spread out. Put a drop of water on it, it sits there. You need oily ink to ink metal type evenly. Okay, so what you're thinking? So ink, it turns out, is in Gutenberg's time, the oil was plant-based oil, linseed oil. In fact, you boil it to make it extra sticky, and then you grind pigment into it. Works very well. The pigment you tend to grind into it for black is just soot. Carbon black is the fancy name for it, but it's soot. And it works extremely well with paper. And I'm going to try and give you the very simple explanation of why. Paper is a plant-based product. Ink is a plant-based product. Nice plant-based oil, nice plant-based carbon, they stick together. If you've ever seen a Gutenberg Bible, I can assure you, and I'm sure the conservators would tell you the same thing, the ink hasn't come off after 500 and odd years. It's a very good bond it makes with it. Some water-based ink's not so good. By the time the water's evaporated, the particles of pigment are left sort of kind of mingled with the surface, but they will come off. Beautiful. Okay, principles of printing. Raised surface, bit of ink, squash a piece of paper against it. The object of the ink on the paper, and this is where I'm going to disappoint all you literary scholars, the object of the ink on the paper is to obliterate the colour of the paper. It also happens to spell words and stuff, but I mean, that's entirely incidental. The point is to get a nice black image on a nice white background to make it legible. You need a lot of pigment to do that. And you can get a lot of pigment in two ways. You can have a rather dilute ink and put a big thick layer on the type, or you can have a very concentrated amount of pigment, a very thick sticky ink. The dilute version, squash a piece of paper of it on it, splobs off the sides, you get a rather blobby, unclear image. You want the thinnest possible layer of ink with the maximum possible amount of pigment in it. The result is this stuff. Printing ink. This is linseed-based carbon black printing ink, and it is amazingly thick. It is very, very, very thick and sticky. Once it's very thick and sticky and you put it on type, it actually takes quite a lot of force to push the paper against the type, against this thing. You can't just rub the back of the sheet with your paper with your hand. That's why you have printing machines. This is a printing machine, probably early 19th century, it might be late 18th century, but probably early 19th century. Came from a printer's in Woolwich in 1930. John Johnson bought it when he was working at the University Press, and it subsequently migrated here. He had an eye for these things. It's actually a very interesting illustration. 1930, what was a printer doing in Woolwich with a wooden press? He was being typically printerly, not throwing away something that was still possibly useful. You know, iron presses were invented in 1800, and the famous one, Albion, 1820. A century and a bit later, this thing was still sat in a printing works, occasionally being used. That is very typical of printers. They don't buy new machinery unless they have to, and this still served a purpose. Okay, so demonstration. Here we have the type surface. Here we have the squishy ink, very thick, sticky ink. Put one on the other. At this point, I'm going to make my excuse, which is that this thing hasn't printed for a couple of years, and I'm assuming it's going to do the job correctly. And I'm also assuming that the first print is going to be rather inferior, just so that I can show you something which needs explaining. So we've now got ink on the surface. We now need to place some paper where we can squash it against the ink. So here's a piece of paper. Some rather nice Russian green paper that we were given by a gentleman in Worcester a few weeks ago. For some reason or other, he offered it to about 6 or 7 different establishments, and they all turned him down. And we said yes, and we came away with a couple of 1,000 sheets of exceedingly nice paper. Some of it's pre-war, and some of it German even. You fix it to the tympans. Printing machine, printing principle is very simple. Big flat plate comes down, squashes the paper against the ink. Here's the ink, there's a piece of paper, here's the thing that's going to do the squashing. You need to combine them all. The printing machine does that by folding this over. Hidden in here is some padding material, some spare sheets of paper. The type is theoretically perfectly flat, practically it isn't. And a little bit of padding helps even things out. Also, pushing a piece of hard, in this case wood, against metal surface, you're liable to damage the metal, so you put something in between. Mine's under here, and here we have the first intrigue about this. It doesn't print all at once. Again, material science, it's made of wood, it's not strong enough. You can only print up to an area. You can see this is about 12 inches by 15, 18 inches. Oops. And you can only print so much at a time. The other problem with this one is that the head is not as strong as it should be. So you can print half of it, then you wind it in some further, print the other half, and that is the principle of a two-pull press. You pull the bar twice to cause it to print. We then wind it out again, and if I'm right, this should be a thoroughly indifferent print, which is, it is, how pleasing. I'm sure to grab that. It's really not very good at all. I am going to try and do a better one by a very, very, very simple trick. And here I would remind you, when he's trying to inculcate in you, the reason printers print. Anyone? Why do printers print? Why do the people pulling the bar on a printing machine do it? What's their objective in life? Huh?
Earn money for beer.
Yeah, you must have been on one of my courses. Exactly. The people who do the work, their objective in life is to have enough money to go to the pub. And what they want is anything that will make their job quicker, easier, or cheaper. And one of the very simple tricks to get a better print is what I will now demonstrate. So, same printing machine, same amount of ink, same sort of paper. roughly, I have to say roughly because it's a bit difficult to judge these things, but roughly the same amount of pressure. We'll see what happens. And do bear in mind this is 2 years since I last did this. But so it's a bit more convincing. Anyone know what the difference is? Someone who must do. The paper's damp. This is why you dampen paper. I've read all sorts of explanations of why you dampen paper. You dampen paper so that you can get to the pub sooner. It makes the printing easier, and there's all sorts of spurious explanations of why. You know, paper is more receptive to ink and blah, 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 blah. The simple explanation, the simple material scientist, engineer's explanation is if you look at a sheet of paper under a microscope, it's a series of hills and valleys across the surface. To get a continuous black, you have to squash the hill down to the level of the valley. Make it damp, it's easier to squash. That's it. So, that's a demonstration of printing. The words on here, I did actually stop and look at them yesterday afternoon. It's not something printers usually do, but I did stop and look at them. And there's quite a bit of Shakespeare, and rather repetitive Shakespeare. This particular form is just made up of bits and pieces we had hanging around. It's not a continuous book. But that is printing using a 19th century printing machine. And please, if you're looking at something odd in a book, just remember why printers print. And if that oddity can be explained by an ability to get to the pub sooner, that's probably the reason. It's not some authorial cleverness. It's printers being lazy. I think I'll stop there, but I'll take questions.